The Soprano Trombone. The Soprano Trombone project started in 2011. The BBC Symphony Orchestra asked me to play second soprano trombone in a big, huge score by Brian Fernyhough. What stuck in my mind immediately, having been lent this instrument, that I fell in love with playing it. So my background is as a trumpet player, and playing this instrument really explained to me, even more than I already knew, how special the trombone is. It's a totally unique instrument, but what I hadn't quite grasped was the minute control you have of the notes and how you express music. There were a number of question marks that sort of sprung up in my mind. It seemed curious to me that an instrument that clearly had a long history, J.S. Bach had written for it. Not many instruments survive, but a few instruments survive. I think the oldest, I forget the date now, but the oldest one is from the 1670s. There's certainly an instrument that I've played, which exists in Stockholm from 1770. There's another instrument in Edinburgh which I've also played, which is, I seem to remember, is sometime 19th century. But it's a bit of a question mark for how old it is. I don't think they really know. So we have circumstantial evidence that this is an instrument with quite a history. Nevertheless, no one plays it. Very little is known about it. Even our most famous historians can really not tell us very much about it. And I thought I'd just let you know briefly what this Soprano Trombone project is about, because it's not just to do with Brian Fernyhough and historical curiosities. It's much wider than that. And so an overview would, as you've seen the beginning of it, and you've seen my interest in the historical side of it. Another side of it, so the other end, historically speaking, is the present day, because it's such an exciting instrument in terms of creating new music. Part of the inspiration for starting and carrying on such a project, a slightly crazy project, you might well say, is that I felt there was a lot of potential in this instrument. Potential that precious few people would see. And for understandable reasons, I'll come to that. But nevertheless, I asked myself, why on earth does this instrument not warrant its own place and with some genuine content? It doesn't really exist very much at all. My aim really was to try and fill that gap in a little bit, and certainly for myself I wanted to explore if I could learn to play it and to what level I could learn to play it. If these kind of musical ideas that I had in my mind could be realised, I wanted to find out whether I could interest composers in writing music for me and for the instrument. Both as a solo instrument, as an ensemble instrument, and all those things have happened way beyond my wildest dreams. So if you look up my links to the Soprano Trombone project with my name, part of the project, which I hadn't foreseen exactly, but it sort of gradually just dawned on me that why isn't this a great starter instrument for very young brass players? I became a qualified Suzuki soprano trombone teacher, the first in the world, and I went through that year's training paid for by the Royal College of Music where I work. My motivation for doing it was to a great extent to find out whether it is a good idea to start playing a brass instrument at a very young age of, say, 4 or 5. The answer is yes. In my mind, there's no doubt about it. That's a separate discussion. If you're interested, have a look at my article in the International Trumpet Guild's journal from October 2020. I write about my experiences in this, and not least others' experiences in this, because there is some real expertise in the area. So I think it's a great instrument for young trombonists. And by the way, they should read it in bass clef. It makes an awful lot of sense. They don't need to worry about a new clef when they start the tenor trombone. And they could have an alto trombone in between as well. Some people like to start them on the alto. I would say the soprano is a great instrument too. And of course, there's a great repertoire. You can use beginner trombone repertoire in bass clef. And it doesn't really matter at that level that it comes out an octave higher. The educational side became quite important in my mind. And the project sort of grew in dimensions the longer I went on. As part of the educational project, I have an association with the Music Teachers Board, a relatively new music examination board based in the UK, but it's worldwide. I have been promoted to head of Soprano Trombone for the Music Teachers Board. It's one little route you can take as a beginner trombonist. You know, what shall I do with this instrument? You can go down that route and have a kind of line of motivation. But one of the first things that cropped up as a big question mark, why is this instrument often referred to as a slide trumpet? Didn't make any sense to me. Still doesn't make any sense to me. There's a 17th, 18th century single slide instrument called slide trumpet, but it's quite a different musical instrument. Various grey areas in between the double-slided trombone and the single-slided slide trumpet. I can see that confusion can arise there, but these days when you look at inexpensive soprano trombones for 150 quid, why they can be called slide trumpets, I don't really know. But in my mind, they shouldn't be. You know, you feel free to call them what you like, of course. In my mind, it's a trombone. It's quite an important point. It needs to sound like a trombone. You need a trombonist's mind. You need a trombonist's approach to music to play this instrument. I think that's really important. And not least, you need a trombonist's outlook when you design instruments, which isn't really happening at the moment. So one of the first things I did was to commission this instrument from Tyne. I travelled over there a couple of times and we had discussions and they were massively helpful. They already made soprano trombones, but not like this one. I wanted a large instrument, large bell, large bore, F valve, crucially. Doesn't make any sense not to have an F valve at all. Particularly since because of the size of the soprano trombone, the seventh position isn't always great. So this instrument is unique, as far as I know, and it's been a springboard for me. The difficulties of the instrument, the soprano trombone, is twofold. One is the instrument, the available instruments, which generally are not terribly. Small trumpet mouthpiece, small bore, small bell, and they sound, I think, a lot of them, they're fine for beginners. They really are. I would wholeheartedly recommend that. But if you're a professional player and you actually want to make a decent noise on these things, and you want it to be versatile as well, usable, with a good slide and so on, there's precious little out there for us. So that's one issue with the instrument. The other one is the players. There aren't any players, really. There are a few exceptions, people who can sort of honk away at it and do it really impressively. But nevertheless, there's not a multitude of players who are able to play it to any level to speak of. And the reason the tessitura is too high for trombone is that mouthpiece, if you put a trombone mouthpiece in it, it just doesn't balance with the instrument. The other one is that if trumpet players are going to play it, they have to learn slide technique, which takes a very long time, as a lot of you will know. And as my good friend John Kenny says, the instrument falls between two stools. So there is that issue. But really, there's no reason why the instrument shouldn't be absolutely great in itself, and there's no reason why players should be able to play really well on it. One thing I often hear from people is that you have to be so precise with the positions. So I often hear that you can't learn to play it because it's just too difficult. My answer to that is that you've got an advantage in the minute distances as well as difficulty. Difficulty can be overcome by practice. The advantage is that it's a more agile, in theory, a more agile instrument because you don't have quite so far to reach between positions. An interesting little historical episode of my research was approaching Edward Tarr about this issue about names. Edward Tarr, the great historian, I asked him, because I saw some texts of his where it seemed to me slightly confused in his own writing, whether he was talking about a trumpet or a trombone. I wrote to him and asked him, where is the difference exactly? I've got his reply here. Dear Torbjörn, your quote from my review of Sabine Klaas's book make me wonder if the soprano trombone and the slide trumpet really are two different instruments, if both have a double slide. If there's anyone capable of coming up with hard and fast definitions of both instruments, it has to be you, meaning me. I take that with a massive pinch of salt, a spoonful, but I found that quite amusing and a nice personal touch. If a given instrument resembles the alto trombone but is smaller, I suppose that would have to be called a soprano trombone. Clearly, even in the minds of our most respected historians, this is not a clear-cut issue. But what I think is clear-cut is that the single slide instrument that has to be called a slide trumpet is not fully chromatic. This one has to be called a soprano trombone. I can't see any other sensible name for it. The contemporary side of my project has, for me, been the most inspiring one. Really what drives me on as a musician is contemporary music, the contemporary voice. I very much feel that music exists in today, and music that's created today is the voice of today, and that to me is a very strong thing. So the instrument and the music that's been written for me, I just loved. Written as part of an ensemble. I performed with the London Sinfonietta only last November in the second performance of More by Matthew Herbert, which is a half-hour long piece for soprano trombone and percussion. Myself premiered and performed and recorded on video mainly a whole host of new music. If you check my website, if you check the web pages of the Soprano Trombone project, see who the composers are, what the music is, what the recordings are. A lot of the music I do is with live electronics. My own setup, I had to recreate it when I moved to the trombone. For years I've been using the trumpet for live electronics, and I still do. I tend to play with one hand and control with my other hand. Whereas on this instrument, of course, you need both hands to play. There's no other way. And so I developed a new set of hardware controllers which I operate with my feet. That's a whole other dimension of this project that has been developed and is under development, and I look forward to many new things. Do get in touch. Love to hear from you. Questions, suggestions. If you want to write for the instrument, not quite sure how, the educational side, the live electronic historic soprano trombone project, I can say it now.
Thank